Your mum left school at 16, maybe 15. She didn't go to university because girls like her didn't go to university. That wasn't a thought anyone had. Not her parents, not her teachers, not her. She left school on a Friday and started work on a Monday because that's what you did. She didn't choose her career from a list of options. She didn't attend a graduate fair or update her LinkedIn profile. She walked into the nearest factory, shop, office, or salon, asked if they had anything going, and started the following week. Her starting wage was barely enough to cover her bus fare and a bit left over for herself. The rest went to her mum for housekeeping. That was the deal, and she got on with it. This is what your mum's first job actually looked like, not the sanitized version, not the things were simpler then version, the real one, the shop girl. For millions of British women, the first job was behind a counter, not a supermarket checkout, a proper shop counter, a wooden counter with a till that didn't scan barcodes because barcodes didn't exist, a till with buttons that you pressed, a drawer that opened with a clang, and a roll of paper that printed the total in purple ink. Your mum stood behind that counter for 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. Saturday was the busiest day and the one she was never ever allowed to have off. She wore a uniform or a shop coat and she was expected to look presentable at all times. Hair tidy, nails clean, shoes polished. The manager checked. She learned to count change backwards from the price of the item up to whatever the customer handed her. If someone bought something for 3 shillings and sixpence and paid with a 10-bob note, she'd count up from 3 and 6 to 10, putting coins in the customer's hand as she went, without a calculator, without a screen telling her what to give back. Just mental arithmetic, performed instantly, dozens of times an hour, with a queue of people watching. If the till was short at the end of the day, even by a few pence, it came out of her wages. If a customer complained, even unfairly, the manager sided with the customer, always. Your mum learned very quickly that the customer was right, even when the customer was clearly, obviously, aggressively wrong. She was on her feet all day. There was no sitting down behind the counter. Some shops didn't even have a stool. She got a half-hour lunch break, eaten in a back room that smelled of cardboard and cleaning products, and 2 15-minute tea breaks if the manager was in a good mood. If the shop was busy, she didn't get the break. Nobody compensated her for it. The pay was dreadful. Women were paid less than men as a matter of routine and policy. The Equal Pay Act didn't arrive until 1970, and even after that, enforcement was slow and patchy. Your mum earned less than the boy who started the same week, doing the same job, on the same counter. Everyone knew it. Nobody questioned it. That was just how it was. She stayed in that shop for 2 years, maybe 3, before moving on to something else. Or maybe she stayed for 30 years, worked her way up to supervisor, and retired from the same building she'd walked into as a teenager. Both stories are equally common. The factory girl. If your mum grew up near a factory, she probably worked in one. And if she worked in one, she'll remember the noise. Factories in the 1960s and 70s were loud in a way that modern workplaces simply aren't allowed to be. Machines stamped, pressed, cut, and stitched at volumes that made conversation impossible. Women shouted at each other across the line, learned to lip read, and developed a system of hand signals that got them through the day. Hearing protection wasn't provided. Hearing damage wasn't discussed. You just got used to it, and then 20 years later, you couldn't hear the television properly, and nobody connected the two things. The work was repetitive, unbelievably, mind-numbingly repetitive. Your mum might have spent her entire shift putting lids on bottles, or folding fabric, or inspecting biscuits on a conveyor belt, pulling out the broken ones before they reached the packing station. The same motion, hundreds of times an hour, thousands of times a day, for years. She stood or sat in the same position for so long that her body shaped itself around the job. Women who worked sewing machines developed shoulder problems. Women who worked standing developed varicose veins in their 20s. Women who worked in cold storage wore 3 layers and still couldn't feel their fingers by lunchtime. But the factory had something that other jobs didn't: camaraderie. The women on the line looked after each other. They covered for each other during toilet breaks. They pooled money for birthday cards and leaving gifts. They knew each other's children's names, each other's husbands' drinking habits, each other's mother-in-law problems. The factory floor was its own community, and the friendships forged there lasted decades. The break room was where everything happened. 15 minutes to eat a sandwich, drink a cup of tea, and talk at a speed that would make an auctioneer dizzy. Your mum's break room conversations covered everything from last night's Coronation Street to who was pregnant, who was getting divorced, and who had been seen coming out of the bookies when she was supposed to be at the dentist. When British manufacturing declined in the 1980s and 90s, factories closed by the thousand. The communities they'd sustained were devastated. Women who'd worked the same line for 20 years were told to go home, and many of them never found work that matched the wages or the companionship again. The office junior, if your mum was good at school or if she'd done a secretarial course at the local college, her first job might have been in an office, but not as a secretary, not yet. She started as the office junior, which was the polite way of saying she did everything nobody else wanted to do. She made the tea. She answered the phones when the switchboard operator was on her break. She collected the post, sorted it, and delivered it to every desk in the building. She filed documents into cabinets using a system she'd been shown once and was expected to remember forever. She ran errands to the stationery cupboard, the post office, and occasionally the sandwich shop, where she'd carry back a tray of coffees for the entire department and somehow be blamed if anyone's order was wrong. The office junior was invisible and essential at the same time. Nobody noticed when she was doing her job correctly. Everyone noticed the instant she wasn't. She earned almost nothing, less than the factory girls, often. But the office was seen as respectable, which mattered to her parents. Clean hands, nice clothes, indoor work. The fact that she spent most of her day being spoken to like a servant by men who couldn't operate their own filing cabinets was beside the point. If she was lucky, and if she was good, she'd be promoted to typist, then secretary, then personal assistant. Each step up meant slightly more money, slightly more responsibility, and significantly more work. The secretaries ran those offices. They managed diaries, booked meetings, organized travel, handled confidential correspondence, and essentially kept their bosses' professional lives from falling apart. And they did it while being called love and asked to make the coffee. Some women became office managers, running departments with quiet, terrifying efficiency. These were the women who knew where everything was, how everything worked, and what would happen if they took a day off. The answer usually was chaos. The office junior role doesn't really exist anymore. Interns do some of what she did, but with degrees and unpaid contracts instead of wages and a clear path upward. Your mum's generation walked into an office at 16 and walked out at 60 with a pension and a card signed by people she'd worked with for half her life. That trajectory barely exists now. The hairdresser's apprentice. If your mum had any interest in hair, or if her own mum decided she should learn a trade, she might have started as a hairdresser's apprentice. This sounded glamorous. It was not glamorous. An apprentice hairdresser's primary job was sweeping up hair, mountains of it, all day. Between every client, she'd sweep the cuttings into a pile, bag them up, and mop the floor. She also washed hair, which meant standing at the basin for hours with her hands in warm water, massaging shampoo into scalps while her back slowly destroyed itself from leaning over at the wrong angle. She wasn't allowed to cut, not for months, sometimes not for a year. She watched the senior stylists work, studied what they did, and practiced on mannequin heads in the back room during quiet periods. When she was finally allowed to cut a real person's hair, it was usually a regular who'd been warned in advance and told it would be free. The salon was a social hub. Women came to get their hair done, not just for the hairstyle, but for the conversation. The hairdresser's chair was a confessional. Clients told their stylist things they wouldn't tell their husbands, their doctors, or their priests. Your mum, standing at the basin at 17, heard things about marriage, infidelity, illness, and family secrets that would curl your hair without any rollers. Speaking of rollers, if your mum trained in the 1960s or 70s, she learned to set hair in rollers under a hooded dryer. Women would sit with their heads covered in plastic rollers under a dome that blasted hot air, reading magazines and drinking tea for 45 minutes at a time. The finished result was a solid, lacquered helmet of curls that could survive a hurricane and didn't move between appointments. Perming was another skill she'd have learned. The chemical solution stank, the rods took forever to wind, and if the timing was wrong, the client's hair would either be completely straight or so tightly curled it looked like a poodle. Getting the perm right was the dividing line between a competent hairdresser and a good one. Your mum might have stayed in hairdressing her whole life. Many women did, eventually opening their own small salons, working from home, or renting a chair in someone else's shop. The trade hasn't disappeared, but the apprenticeship system that trained your mum, the years of sweeping and watching before you were trusted with scissors, that's been replaced by college courses and fast-tracked qualifications. Whether that's better or worse depends on who you ask. The nurse. If your mum became a nurse, she didn't go to university for it. She went to a hospital, enrolled in a training program, and learned on the ward. Student nurses in the 1960s and 70s were thrown into clinical work almost immediately, performing tasks that today would require years of training and multiple qualifications. She emptied bedpans, she bathed patients, she changed dressings on wounds that would have made most people faint. She held the hands of people who were dying, and then she stripped the bed and made it up again for the next patient. She did this at 18 years old, often on night shifts, in wards that were understaffed, under-resourced, and overwhelming. The hierarchy was rigid. Matron ruled the hospital with an authority that made military discipline look casual. Ward sisters ran their wards like personal kingdoms. Student nurses were at the bottom, expected to be obedient, punctual, immaculate, and silent unless spoken to. Your mum's cap had to be pinned at the correct angle. Her apron had to be spotless. Her shoes had to be polished. If matron found a crease in the wrong place, the entire shift was ruined. The hours were brutal. Split shifts were common. You'd work 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, go home for 4 hours, then come back and work 6 in the evening until 10 at night. By the time you factored in travel, you'd been away from home for 16 hours and been paid for 12. Overtime was expected. Complaining about overtime was not. The emotional weight was enormous. Your mum saw things in her first year of nursing that nobody should have to see at 18. She saw children die. She saw accident victims brought in from motorways. She saw old people lying in beds with nobody visiting them, week after week. She went home after those shifts and sat quietly in the kitchen, and when someone asked if she was all right, she said she was fine, because that was what nurses did. The pay was a joke. Nursing was considered a vocation, which was the polite way of saying that society expected women to do emotionally devastating work for very little money, because caring was supposed to be its own reward. Your mum stayed because she was good at it, because the patients needed her, and because the women she worked with understood what the job cost in a way that nobody outside the hospital ever could. The friendships she made on those wards were forged under pressure that most workplaces can't imagine, and they lasted forever. The barmaid. Plenty of women's first jobs were behind a bar, and the pub was a very different workplace to the one it is now. Your mum pulled pints. Real pints from a hand pump that required actual physical effort. She learned to tilt the glass at the right angle, pull the handle at the right speed, and top it off with just enough head to satisfy the regulars without giving away free beer. If the head was too big, she'd hear about it. If the head was too small, she'd hear about it. The perfect pint was a skill, and the regulars were merciless critics. She dealt with drunk men every single shift. Men who thought being served a drink entitled them to a comment about her appearance. Men who leaned over the bar and said things that would get them barred instantly today, but were considered harmless banter in 1975. Your mum learned to deflect, to joke back, to shut it down without causing a scene, and to pour a pint with one hand while removing someone's arm from the bar with the other. She was 17. She handled it because she had to. The landlord was the law. Whatever he said went. If he said you were working Christmas Day, you were working Christmas Day. If he said you weren't getting a break tonight because it was too busy, you didn't get a break. If he said the till was short and it was coming out of your tips, it came out of your tips. Employment rights existed on paper. In practice, behind the bar of a 1970s pub, they were largely theoretical. Closing time was chaos. Last orders at 10:30, everyone out by 11, and then your mum would spend an hour cleaning up, washing glasses by hand in a sink behind the bar, wiping down tables, mopping a floor that was sticky with spilled beer and covered in crisp packets, emptying ashtrays that were overflowing with cigarette ends because everyone smoked inside and the pub air was thick enough to chew. She walked home afterwards, often alone, often in the dark, often smelling of beer and cigarettes, with her tips in her pocket and her feet aching. She did it again the next night and the night after that. What nobody told her. Here's what connected all these jobs, whether it was the shop, the factory, the office, the salon, the hospital, or the pub. Nobody told your mum it would be easy, and nobody told her she deserved better. She was expected to work hard, keep quiet, look presentable, and be grateful for the opportunity. She was expected to tolerate things that would trigger an employment tribunal today. She was expected to earn less than men, accept less than men, and say thank you for less than men. And she did, not because she was weak, but because the alternative was no job at all. Your mum didn't have a career plan. She had a wage. She had bills. She had a family that needed feeding. She got up every morning and went to work in conditions that ranged from dull to difficult to genuinely dangerous. And she did it without complaining, because complaining didn't change anything. Working did. The world has changed since then. Pay gaps have narrowed, though they haven't closed. Working conditions have improved. Legal protections exist. Women can choose careers, not just jobs, and all of that progress was built on the backs of women like your mum, who worked through the hard years so that the next generation wouldn't have to. She probably never described it that way. She probably just said, "It was all right, wasn't it? You got on with it." If your mum's first job was one of these, or something we didn't cover, put it in the comments. Tell us what she did, where she worked, and what she remembers, because her story matters more than she probably thinks. If you want more stories from the generation that built everything, that video is on screen now. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.